Now, I'm told academia isn't quite that bad, but even university life has its forms of urbane savagery, its competitive status seeking and alpha male dominance rituals, a zero-sum game with many losers. Too many of our preferences reflect nasty behaviours and states of mind that were genetically adaptive in the ancestral environment. Instead, wouldn't it be better if we rewrote our own corrupt code? I focused here on genetically enhancing hedonic tone, yet mastery of the biology of emotion means that we'll be able, for instance, to enlarge our capacity for empathy, functionally amplifying mirror neurons and engineering a sustained increase in oxytocin release to promote trust and sociability. Likewise, we can identify the molecular signatures of, say, spirituality, our aesthetic sense, or our sense of humour, and modulate and overexpress their psychological machinery too. From an information theoretic perspective, what is critical to an adaptive, flexible, intelligent response to the world is not our absolute point on a hedonic scale, but that we are informationally sensitive to differences. Indeed, information theorists sometimes simply define information as a difference that makes a difference. However, to stress again, this re-encephalization of emotional is optional. It's technically feasible to engineer the well-being of all sentience and retain most but not all of our existing preference architecture. The three technical options for abolishing suffering that I've presented, warheading, designer drugs and genetic engineering, aren't mutually exclusive. Are they exhaustive? I don't know of any other viable options. Some transhumanists believe that we could one day all be scanned, digitized and uploaded into inorganic computers and reprogrammed. Well, perhaps. I'm skeptical, but in any case this proposal doesn't solve the suffering of existing organic life unless we embrace so-called destructive uploading, a Holocaust option I'm not even going to consider here. 2. Why it should happen. Assume that within the next few centuries we will acquire these godlike powers over our emotions. Assume, too, that the signalling function of unpleasant experience can be replaced, either through the recalibration argued for here, or through the offloading of everything unpleasant or routine onto inorganic prostheses, bionic implants, or inorganic computers, or perhaps through outright elimination in the case of something like jealousy. Why should we all be abolitionists? If one is a classical utilitarian, then the abolitionist project follows. It's Bentham plus biotechnology. One doesn't have to be a classical utilitarian to endorse the abolition of suffering, but all classical utilitarians should embrace the abolitionist project. Bentham championed social and legislative reform, which is great as far as it goes, but he was working before the era of biotechnology and genetic medicine. If one is a scientifically enlightened Buddhist, then the abolitionist project follows too. Buddhists, uniquely among the world's religions, focus on the primacy of suffering in the living world. Buddhists may think that the Noble Eightfold Path offers a surer route to nirvana than genetic engineering. It's hard for a Buddhist to argue in principle against biotech if it works. Buddhists focus on relieving suffering via the extinction of desire, yet it's worth noting this extinction is technically optional and might arguably lead to a stagnant society. Instead, it's possible to abolish suffering and continue to have all manner of desires. Persuading followers of Islam and the Judeo-Christian tradition is more of a challenge, but believers claim, despite anomalies in the empirical evidence, that Allah God is infinitely compassionate and merciful. So if mere mortals can envisage the well-being of all sentience, it would seem blasphemous to claim that God is more limited in the scope of his benevolence. Most contemporary philosophers aren't classical utilitarians or Buddhists or theists. Why should, say, an ethical pluralist take the abolitionist project seriously? Here I want to take as my text Shakespeare's, quote, "For there was never yet philosopher that could endure the toothache patiently," end quote. Much Ado About Nothing, Scene 5, Act 1, Leonardo speaking. When one is struck by excruciating physical pain, one is always shocked at just how frightful it can be. It's tempting to suppose that purely psychological pain, loneliness, rejection, existential angst, grief, anxiety, depression, can't be as atrocious as extreme physical pain, yet the reason over 800,000 people in the world take their own lives each year is mainly psychological distress. It's not that other things, great art, friendship, social justice, a sense of humour, cultivating excellence of character, academic scholarship, etc., aren't valuable, but rather when intense pain or psychological distress intrudes, either in one's own life or that of a loved one, we recognise that this intense pain has immediate priority and urgency. If you are in agony after catching your hand in the door, then you'd give short shrift to someone who urged you to remember the finer things in life. If you're distraught after an unhappy love affair, then you don't want to be tactlessly reminded it's a beautiful day outside. Okay, while it lasts, extreme pain or psychological distress has an urgency and priority that overrides the rest of one's life projects. But so what? When the misery passes, why not just get on with one's life as before? Well, natural science aspires to a view from nowhere, a notional God's eye view. Physics tells us that no here and now is privileged over any other. All are equally real. Science and technology are shortly going to give us godlike powers over the entire living world to match this godlike perspective. I argue that so long as there is any sentient being who is undergoing suffering similar to our distress, that suffering should be tackled with the same priority and urgency as if it were one's own pain or the pain of a loved one. With power comes complicity. Godlike powers carry godlike responsibilities. Thus the existence of suffering 200 years ago, for instance, may indeed have been terrible, but it's not clear that such suffering can sensibly be called immoral, because there wasn't much that could be done about it. But thanks to biotechnology, now there is, or shortly will be. Over the next few centuries, suffering of any kind is going to become optional. If you're not a classical utilitarian, the advantage of recalibrating the hedonic treadmill rather than simply seeking to maximize super-happiness is that you are retaining at least a recognizable descendant of our existing preference architecture. Recalibration of the hedonic treadmill can be made consistent with your existing value scheme. Hence even the ill-named preference utilitarian can be accommodated. Indeed, control over the emotions means that you can pursue your existing life projects more effectively. And what about the alleged character-building function of suffering? That which does not crush me makes me stronger, said Nietzsche. This worry seems misplaced. Other things being equal, enhancing hedonic tone strengthens motivation. It makes us psychologically more robust. By contrast, prolonged low mood leads to a syndrome of learned helplessness and behavioural despair. I haven't explicitly addressed the value nihilist, the subjectivist or ethical skeptic who says all values are simply matters of opinion and that one can't logically derive an ought from an is. Well, let's say I find myself in agony because my hand is on a hot stove. That agony is intrinsically motivating, even if my conviction that I ought to withdraw my hand doesn't follow the formal canons of logical inference. If one takes the scientific world picture seriously, then there is nothing ontologically special or privileged about here and now, or me. The egocentric illusion is a trick of perspective engineered by selfish DNA. If it's wrong for me to be in agony, then it's wrong for anyone, anywhere. 3. Why it will happen. Okay, it's technically feasible. A world without suffering would be wonderful, and full-blown paradise engineering even better. But again, so what? It's technically feasible to build a 1,000-metre cube of cheddar cheese. Why is a pain-free world going to happen? Perhaps it's just wishful thinking. Perhaps we'll opt to retain the biology of suffering indefinitely. The counter-argument here is that whether or not one is sympathetic to the abolitionist project, we are heading for a reproductive revolution of designer babies. Prospective parents are soon going to be choosing the characteristics of their future children. We're on the eve of the post-Darwinian transition, not in the sense that selection pressure will be any less severe, but evolution will no longer be blind and random. There will no longer be natural selection but unnatural selection. We will be choosing the genetic makeup of our future offspring, selecting and designing alleles and allelic combinations in anticipation of their consequences. There will be selection pressure against nastier alleles and allelic combinations that were adaptive in the ancestral environment. Unfortunately, this isn't a rigorous argument, but imagine you are choosing the genetic dial settings for mood, the hedonic set point, of your future children. What dial settings would you pick? You might not want gradients of lifelong super happiness, but the overwhelming bulk of parents will surely want to choose happy children. For a start, they are more fun to raise. Most parents across most cultures say, I think sincerely, that they want their children to be happy. One may be sceptical of parents who say happiness is the only thing they care about for their kids. Many parents are highly ambitious. But other things being equal, happiness signals success, possibly the ultimate evolutionary origin of why we value the happiness of our children as well as our own. Of course, the parental choice argument isn't decisive. Not least, it's unclear how many more generations of free reproductive choices lie ahead before radical anti-aging technologies force a progressively tighter collective control over our reproductive decisions, since a swelling population of ageless quasi-immortals can't multiply indefinitely in finite physical space. But even if centralized control of reproductive decisions becomes the norm, and procreation itself becomes rare, the selection pressure against primitive Darwinian genotypes will presumably be intense. Thus it's hard to envisage what future social formations would really allow the premeditated creation of any predisposition to depressive or anxiety disorders, or even the normal pathologies of unenhanced consciousness. Non-human animals. So far, I've focused on suffering in just one species. This restriction of the abolitionist project is parochial, but our anthropocentric bias is deeply rooted. Hunting, killing, and exploiting members of other species enhance the inclusive fitness of our genes in the ancestral environment. Here we are more akin to chimpanzees than bonobos. So unlike, say, the incest taboo, we don't have an innate predisposition to find, say, hunting and exploiting non-human animals wrong. We read that Irene Pepperberg's parrot, with whom we last shared a common ancestor several 100 million years ago, had the mental age of a 3-year-old child, but it's still legal for so-called sportsmen to shoot birds for fun. If sportsmen shot babies and toddlers of our own species for fun, they'd be judged criminal sociopaths and locked up. So there was a contrast. The lead story in the news media is often a terrible case of human child abuse and neglect, an abducted toddler or abandoned Romanian orphans. Our greatest hate figures are child abusers and child murderers, yet we routinely pay for the industrialized mass killing of other sentient beings so we can eat them. We eat meat even though there's a wealth of evidence that functionally, emotionally, intellectually, and critically in their capacity to suffer, the non-human animals we factory farm and kill are equivalent to human babies and toddlers. From a notional God's eye perspective, I'd argue that morally we should care just as much about the abuse of functionally equivalent non-human animals as we do about members of our own species, about the abuse and killing of a pig as we do about the abuse or killing of a human toddler. This violates our human moral intuitions, but our moral intuitions simply can't be trusted. They reflect our anthropocentric bias, not just a moral limitation, but an intellectual and perceptual limitation too. It's not that there are no differences between human and non-human animals, any more than there are no differences between black people and white people, freeborn citizens and slaves, men and women, Jews and Gentiles, gays or heterosexuals. The question is rather, are they morally relevant differences? This matters because morally catastrophic consequences can ensue when we latch on to a real but morally irrelevant difference between sentient beings. Recall how Aristotle, for instance, defended slavery. How could he be so blind? Our moral intuitions are poisoned by genetic self-interest. They weren't designed to take an impartial God's eye view. But greater intelligence brings greater cognitive capacity for empathy, and potentially an extended circle of compassion. Maybe our super-intelligent, super-empathetic descendants will view non-human animal abuse as no less abhorrent than we view child abuse, a terrible perversion. True or not, surely we aren't going to give up eating each other. Our self-interested bias is too strong. We like the taste of meat too much. Isn't the notion of global veganism just utopian dreaming? Perhaps so, yet within a few decades, the advent of genetically engineered vat food means that we can enjoy eating meat tastier than anything available today without any killing and cruelty.